There's an act of worship that we can do as a means of gaining closeness to Allah, as a means of reward. But that act of worship is not something which is mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah. Then that, as the scholars have said, is by default an insult to the Prophet ﷺ. How? Because that by default is then saying that the Prophet ﷺ hasn't told us everything we need to know. We've had to think of this way of worship. We've brought about this new way of worship, this new obedience, and this is going to bring us closer to Allah. And the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell us that. It's not in the Quran and the Sunnah. That by default is an insult to the Prophet ﷺ. It's like saying he didn't finish the religion then. It's an abuse. The ayah of the Quran, what are you going to do with that then when Allah says the religion is complete? الْيَوْمَ أَكْمَلْتُ لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ. So now, even up to there, an individual who claims that the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ is an act of worship, which will bring you closer to Allah if you do it, and you'll be rewarded by Allah if you do it, and it's an act of obedience to Allah and His Messenger to do it, then the first problem they face is that this is an act of worship which has not been mentioned anywhere in the Quran and the Sunnah. There is no evidence in the Quran which says celebrate the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ. There isn't any ayah. There is no hadith which says celebrate the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ. If, and this is the easy way to refute anyone or to explain to anyone who says yes, there are evidences in the Quran and the Sunnah to say that you can celebrate the birthday. They bring evidences sometimes. They bring some ayat from the Quran which they interpret to mean that this is an evidence to celebrate the birthday. They'll bring some hadith, the famous ones they always say, that the Prophet ﷺ used to fast on Mondays and Thursdays. So they say, when the Prophet ﷺ was asked about that, he said, I fast on Mondays because that's the day I was born in. So they say, there you go. The Prophet ﷺ was celebrating his day of birth by fasting on that day. Firstly, the problem is these people now, when they celebrate, they don't fast. They do the complete opposite. They eat as much as they can. So the celebration goes wrong already. The evidence goes wrong already. The Prophet ﷺ said, that's the day I'm fasting on Mondays because I was born on that day. So if that's an evidence for them to say that this is a day of celebration, then they should celebrate the same way the Prophet ﷺ did. Fast on the day, not the opposite. Not go in complete contradiction to that and eat as much as you can on that day. So how are they using that as an evidence? Not that it's an evidence in any case, because all of these different hadith, whatever hadith it is, this is a general rule of thumb you can use. Whatever ayah they bring to you, whatever hadith they bring to you to say that this is an evidence you can celebrate the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ, we say it's impossible. It can't be. It can't be. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يؤمن أحدكم حتى أكون أحب إليه من والده وولده والناس أجمعين. Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. None of you is a true believer, meaning your iman, in completion of it, until I, the Prophet ﷺ, am more beloved to him than his own father, his son, and all of the people. So loving the Prophet ﷺ is an act of worship. It's part of your iman. It's a worship. Loving the Prophet ﷺ is ibadah. And it is a part of your iman. Without a doubt, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, they had the greatest of love for the Prophet ﷺ. If anybody sitting in our time now, anywhere in the world, claims that they love the Prophet ﷺ more than the companions did, I don't think he's going to get very far with that claim. The companions loved the Prophet ﷺ more than we do. They understood the Quran and the Sunnah more than we do. If any individual now brings you any evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah to say this is an evidence that the Mawlid can be celebrated, then tell him it is not. Because if it was, then how come the companions missed it? How could the companions have missed it? More than that, how could it be that this is an evidence for the Mawlid in the Quran as you're quoting, whichever ayah they bring, or the Sunnah as you're quoting, whichever hadith it might be? How can this be an evidence for the Mawlid from the Quran and the Sunnah, yet the Prophet ﷺ didn't do it? And they will accept that. Nobody's going to claim the Prophet ﷺ used to make a day of celebration. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. And nobody's going to try to claim that. They would have to be silly to try and claim that the Prophet ﷺ actually used to do things on the day of his birthday and celebrate. There's not a single narration for that whatsoever. So now, in that case, if they claim that there is an ayah in the Quran which proves the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ, or there's a hadith in the Sunnah that proves you can celebrate the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ, if that's the case and it really does prove that, then how come the Prophet ﷺ didn't do it then? How could he neglect evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah? How could the companions neglect evidences from the Quran and the Sunnah? Or are these people going to claim that they are cleverer than they were? They are cleverer than the companions. The companions missed it. They didn't realize this was an evidence that you can celebrate the birthday, but we have. Again, if somebody claims that, I think that's the end of the argument. Nobody can possibly try to claim that we are cleverer than the companions. We've been able to pick out these evidences in the Quran and the Sunnah that prove the birthday can be celebrated. But they obviously hadn't. How do we know the companions obviously hadn't seen these evidences as these people claim? Or they hadn't understood these same meanings, because there's not a single narration that any of them ever did it. In fact, if you look in history, and I'm sure this was mentioned in the first lecture, for hundreds of years after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, it wasn't even known to anyone what the Mawlid is. This Mawlid wasn't even known to anyone. What is the Mawlid? What is the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ? It wasn't even known as an event for hundreds of years. Some of the scholars say 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, at least 4th century. 300-400 years. It wasn't even known to people. Mawlid. Nobody had heard about it. And that's mentioned in the books. On top of the fact that the Mawlid, so everybody understands that point for a start, that the Quran and the Sunnah, whatever evidence they bring you to say this is the proof, it can't be. Because if it was, then how did the companions not see that? If that really is a proof for the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ in the Quran, an ayah, or a hadith, the Sunnah, then how did all of the companions miss it? And you caught it out. You managed to find it, and all of the other companions didn't see this ayah, didn't see this hadith. Impossible. So therefore we understand there can't be an evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah proving the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ. Because if there was, then the companions would have been the first of the people to implement it and do it. Because they love the Prophet ﷺ more than anyone else. If they found an evidence in the Quran and the Sunnah to say, celebrate the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ, then they wouldn't have missed out on that. They wouldn't have neglected that. They would have been the foremost, the first of the people to take that evidence and to implement it and to do it. But because they didn't, it shows that there never was any evidence in the Quran. There never was any evidence in the Sunnah proving celebrate the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ. If there was, then without a doubt they would have done it. But because they didn't, then you can only say one of two things. Either they missed it, but you're clever and you found it, which is impossible. Or they didn't do it because they didn't understand these evidences to mean that you can celebrate their birthday. And that must be the case. It has to be. The other alternative is impossible. It's impossible for someone to say we know more and we are more knowledgeable than the Prophet ﷺ and the companions concerning these ayat. If that ayah is a proof, then why didn't the Prophet ﷺ celebrate his own birthday and tell the companions to do it?